September 12, 1945. Fort Carson, Colorado. The transport truck lurched to a stop, and Greta Hoffman pressed her palm against the canvas side, steadying herself. Through the gap in the fabric, she could see mountains, impossibly tall and sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The air that rushed in when the tailgate dropped carried a scent she couldn't immediately place, something clean and thin, lacking the heavy industrial smoke that had clung to every breath in Berlin for the past 3 years. Her feet, wrapped in strips of cloth inside canvas shoes with soles worn paper-thin, touched American soil for the first time. The ground felt solid, real, and terrifying. Around her, 11 other women climbed down from the truck, their faces showing the same careful blankness Greta had perfected during interrogations. Show nothing, expect nothing, survive. A female American officer stood waiting, clipboard in hand, her uniform crisp in a way that seemed almost obscene. Her boots, Greta noticed immediately, were leather, thick-soled, and fit her feet properly. Not men's boots cut down, not canvas wrapped with wire. Actual boots made for a woman's foot. The officer's voice cut through the mountain air, speaking German with an Austrian accent. She explained that they would be assigned work details based on their skills. When she said the word skills, several women flinched. In the camps they'd heard about, skills meant harder labor, more danger, more reasons to be discarded when you broke. Greta's hands, scarred with small white lines from electrical burns, tightened into fists inside her pockets. She had listed her occupation as radio technician during processing, a moment of stupid honesty she'd immediately regretted. Radio technicians were valuable. Valuable meant they would use you until there was nothing left. The barracks smelled of fresh pine and something else, something chemical and clean that made her nose itch. Soap. Industrial soap. The bunks had actual mattresses, thin but present, and wool blankets that looked new. One of the women, Margaret, a former factory supervisor from Hamburg, touched a blanket and then jerked her hand back as if burned. "This is wrong," she whispered. "This is how they break you. Make you comfortable, make you grateful, and then—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. They all knew the then. That first night, Greta lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the camp. No screaming, no dogs, just wind through pine trees and the distant sound of men's voices singing something in English. Her feet ached, a deep bone ache she'd stopped noticing years ago, but that now seemed to demand attention in the quiet darkness. She thought about the boots she'd seen on the American officer's feet and felt something dangerous stir in her chest. Not quite hope, more like the memory of what hope had once felt like. The next morning came too early and too gently. No shouting, no whistles, just a knock on the barracks door and the same Austrian-accented voice announcing breakfast in 30 minutes. The mess hall was another shock, though Greta was learning to keep her face still even as her mind reeled. The room was warm, genuinely warm, heated by radiators that clanked and hissed but produced actual heat. The smell hit her before she saw the food, a smell so rich and complex her stomach cramped violently. Eggs. Real eggs, not powder. Coffee, actual coffee with a smell that made her eyes water. And bread, golden brown bread that looked soft inside. The woman serving, an American in an apron, placed a tray in front of Greta without meeting her eyes. The plate held 2 fried eggs, 3 strips of bacon, toast with butter already melting into it, and a small cup of what looked like jam. Strawberry jam. Greta stared at it. Beside her, Margaret made a sound low in her throat, something between a sob and a laugh. "It's poisoned," someone whispered further down the table. "It has to be." But they were all so hungry, and the smell was so overwhelming, and one by one they began to eat. Greta bit into the toast, and the butter flooded her mouth with a richness she'd forgotten existed. The jam was sweet, genuinely sweet, not the chemical sweetness of saccharin but real sugar and real fruit. She ate slowly, carefully, waiting for the nausea or the cramping that always came when you ate too much too fast after months of nothing. It didn't come. The food was real. After breakfast, Greta was separated from the others and led across the compound by a young American soldier who looked barely old enough to shave. He didn't speak German, but he smiled at her, a genuine smile that showed slightly crooked teeth, and gestured for her to follow. They walked past rows of barracks, past a building that smelled like a hospital, sharp with disinfectant, past a recreation yard where male POWs were playing some kind of game with a ball. The men looked healthy, not starving, not beaten, just men playing a game in the September sunshine. The radio operations building was smaller than she'd expected, a single-story structure with a pitched roof and windows that actually had glass in them. The door was unlocked. Inside, the familiar smell of electronics hit her like a physical force. Hot metal, insulation, the particular scent of vacuum tubes warming up. For a moment, she was back in Berlin, in the underground facility where she'd spent 3 years of her life, where the air was always too hot or too cold, and the lights never went out, and the radio sets never stopped crackling with voices from the front. An American man in his 40s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses stood up from a workbench and extended his hand. He spoke in careful, slow German. "Greta Hoffman, I'm Technical Supervisor Robert Chen. I understand you have experience with radio equipment." She nodded, not trusting her voice, not shaking his hand. He didn't seem offended. He gestured around the room, which was filled with equipment she recognized. Standard military radio sets, some American models she'd only seen in intelligence photos, test equipment, oscilloscopes, signal generators. Everything clean, organized, properly maintained. "We need someone who can help with equipment testing and repair," he said. "The work isn't difficult, but it requires attention to detail and a good understanding of radio frequency circuits." He paused, studying her face. "I've read your file. You were a senior technician at the Berlin facility. You worked on encrypted communications equipment." Greta's throat went dry. This was it. This was where they would demand she reveal secrets, betray her country, prove her usefulness by destroying whatever loyalty she had left. Chen must have seen something in her face because he held up both hands. "I'm not asking you to discuss classified work," he said. "That's not my job. I just need someone who knows which end of a soldering iron gets hot." He smiled at his own joke. Greta didn't. He turned to a cabinet and opened it, pulling out a cardboard box. "Before we start," he said, "we need to address safety equipment." He set the box on the workbench and opened it. Inside were boots, not canvas shoes, not men's boots. Actual leather boots with thick rubber soles and laces that looked new. They were brown, well-made, and sized for a woman's foot. "These are for you," Chen said. He pulled them out of the box, and Greta could see the rubber soles clearly, thick and black with a distinctive tread pattern. When working with radio equipment, especially high-voltage test equipment, proper insulation is essential. These boots are rated for electrical work. The rubber soles provide grounding protection. He set them on the bench in front of her. "I need you to try them on and make sure they fit properly. If they don't, we'll get another pair." Safety equipment has to fit correctly or it's useless. Greta stared at the boots. Her vision seemed to narrow, tunneling down until all she could see was the black rubber soles, thick and solid and real. Behind her eyes, a memory surfaced with brutal clarity. The Berlin facility 2 years ago. Winter, though underground you couldn't tell except that the equipment ran colder and took longer to warm up. Christina Bauer, 23 years old, blonde hair always tied back in a regulation bun, standing at her workstation in canvas shoes with soles so thin you could see her toes through the fabric. The high-voltage test equipment had a fault in the grounding that Christina had reported 3 times. 3 times she'd been told to continue working, that replacement parts were allocated to priority repairs, that the equipment was needed for the war effort. The arc, when it came, was blue-white and impossibly bright in the dim underground facility. The sound was like a gunshot. Christina's scream lasted less than 2 seconds before she collapsed. The burns on her feet and legs were degree, the flesh charred black in some places, weeping and red in others. She'd survived, if you could call it that. The last time Greta saw her, Christina was being transferred to some other facility, limping on feet that would never heal properly, her face gray with pain and shame. The chief engineer, Herr Dr. Schmidt, had gathered all the female technicians after the accident. "This is what happens when you don't follow procedures," he'd said, his voice cold. Fraulein Bauer was careless. She failed to properly ground herself before working on the equipment. Let this be a lesson. No one had mentioned the faulty equipment. No one had mentioned the 3 reports. No one had mentioned that proper insulated boots were available, but only for the male engineers, because women's feet were different sizes and special orders required authorization, and authorization required justification, and women's safety apparently didn't justify the paperwork. Greta's hands were shaking. She pressed them against her thighs, trying to stop the tremor, but it spread up her arms and into her shoulders. The boots on the workbench seemed to grow larger, more impossible, more obscene in their simple existence. "Miss Hoffman," Chen's voice was concerned. "Are you all right?" She couldn't answer. Her throat had closed. Behind her eyes another memory. Else Zimmerman 6 months after Christina. Different equipment, same problem. Faulty grounding, reported and ignored. Else had been more experienced, more careful. She tried to jury-rig her own insulation, wrapping her canvas shoes in rubber sheeting scavenged from damaged equipment. It hadn't been enough. The current had found a path through a gap in the wrapping, through the sweat-dampened canvas, through her foot and up her leg. Else had survived too. Her right foot was permanently damaged, 2 toes amputated, nerve damage that left her limping. She'd been reassigned to filing work, her radio skills useless with hands that shook too badly to solder. Greta had worked barefoot after that, when the equipment was powered up. Better to feel any tingle of current immediately than to trust canvas that might as well have been paper. Her feet had been constantly cold in the underground facility, the concrete floor like ice even in summer. Small burns from dropped solder and hot components had left her soles tough and scarred, but at least she could feel the current if something went wrong. At least she had that much control. The male engineers had walked past her workstation in their thick rubber-soled boots, specially ordered from the supply depot, properly sized, properly maintained. When she'd asked once if women's sizes might be available, the supply officer had laughed. "For what?" he'd said. "You're not doing real engineering work, you're just assembling components." Chen was talking again, his voice gentle. "Miss Hoffman, I need you to sit down. You're very pale." She felt his hand on her elbow, guiding her to a stool. The room seemed too bright suddenly, the smell of electronics too strong, too familiar, too full of ghosts. "I worked barefoot," she heard herself say. Her voice sounded strange, distant, for 3 years, around high-voltage equipment, because canvas shoes aren't insulated, because proper boots were for men only. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very softly, "Jesus Christ." The words sounded like a prayer. Greta looked up at him, and his face was horrified, genuinely horrified, not the performative shock of a superior officer, but the real thing. "That's," he started, then stopped. "That's criminally negligent, that's." He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "How many accidents?" "Two that I saw," Greta said. The words were coming easier now, spilling out like water from a broken pipe. Christina Bauer and Else Zimmerman, both from faulty grounding. Both reported multiple times. Both ignored because replacement parts were allocated to priority repairs and women's safety wasn't a priority. She looked down at her hands, at the small white scars that covered her fingers and palms. "I have 17 burn scars from electrical arcs, small ones. I was lucky. I was careful. I learned to work with one hand behind my back so if there was a short, the current wouldn't cross my heart. I learned to test every ground with the back of my hand first, so the current would contract my muscles away from the source instead of making me grab it. I learned to hold my breath when working on powered equipment so I'd pass out faster if I was electrocuted, and maybe the current would stop before it killed me." Chen sat down heavily on another stool. His face had gone pale. "Did anyone," he started, then stopped. "Did anyone ever suggest that maybe, just maybe, you shouldn't be working on powered high-voltage equipment without proper safety gear?" Greta laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "The equipment was needed for the war effort," she said. "The radio sets had to be maintained. The communications had to stay operational. We were told we were serving the fatherland. We were told our sacrifice was necessary. We were told that if we couldn't handle the work, there were plenty of other women who could." She looked at the boots again. They were still there, still real, still impossible. "The male engineers had boots," she said quietly. "Special order from the supply depot, properly sized, properly maintained, replaced when they wore out. We asked why we couldn't have the same. We were told it wasn't in the budget. We were told women's sizes required special authorization. We were told our work wasn't dangerous enough to justify the expense." She felt something hot on her cheeks and realized she was crying. She couldn't remember the last time she'd cried. Not when Berlin fell. Not during the interrogations. Not during the transport to America. But now, sitting in a clean, well-lit American radio operations building, looking at a pair of boots that should have been the most basic safety equipment imaginable, she couldn't stop. "Christina can't walk properly anymore," she said through the tears. "She's 25 years old and she limps like an old woman and her feet hurt all the time, and she'll never work with electronics again, because her hands shake too badly from the nerve damage." Else lost 2 toes. 2 toes because the fatherland couldn't spare the budget for women's boots. Chen didn't say anything. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to her, then turned away, giving her privacy. Greta pressed the cloth to her face. It smelled clean, like soap and starch. American soap. American starch. American boots sitting on an American workbench in an American POW camp where the German prisoners were given breakfast with real eggs and butter and strawberry jam. After a while, Chen spoke. His voice was rough. "In the United States Army," he said, "every person who works with electrical equipment receives proper safety training and proper safety equipment regardless of gender, rank, or job classification. It's not a privilege. It's not a reward. It's basic human decency and sound engineering practice." He turned back to face her. "A worker who's worried about being electrocuted can't focus on their job. A worker who's in pain or afraid can't do quality work. And a worker who's been injured because their superiors were too cheap or too callous to provide basic safety equipment is a victim of a crime, not a casualty of war. He picked up the boots and held them out to her. These boots are yours. They're not a gift. They're not something you have to earn. They're the minimum required safety equipment for the job I'm asking you to do. If they don't fit, we'll get ones that do. If they wear out, we'll replace them. If you need any other safety equipment, gloves, goggles, insulated tools, you tell me and I'll get them. That's my job. Keeping you safe is my job. Greta took the boots. They were heavier than she expected, solid and real in her hands. The leather was stiff, new, unbroken. The rubber soles were thick enough that she could press her thumb into them and feel the give. She unlaced them with shaking fingers and pulled off her canvas shoes. Her feet, wrapped in cloth strips, looked small and pale and scarred. Chen looked away again while she unwrapped the cloth and pulled on the boots. They fit. Not perfectly, a little loose in the heel, but they fit. She laced them up, pulled the laces tight, tied them. Then she stood. The rubber soles were thick enough that she felt taller. The leather supported her ankles. Her feet, for the first time in 3 years, felt protected. She took a step, then another. The boots were stiff. They would need breaking in, but they were real. She looked down at them, at her feet encased in proper leather and rubber, and something inside her chest cracked open. She sat down hard on the stool and put her face in her hands and sobbed. Not quiet tears this time, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere below her ribs, somewhere she'd locked away and refused to acknowledge for 3 years. Chen didn't try to comfort her. He didn't tell her to stop. He just stood there, a respectful distance away, and waited. When she finally stopped, when the sobs had faded to hiccups and then to shaky breathing, he spoke again. "I'm going to show you the safety procedures we use here," he said. "They're probably different from what you're used to. First rule, never work on powered equipment alone. Always have a spotter who can cut power if something goes wrong. Second rule, if equipment is malfunctioning, you report it immediately and we take it offline until it's repaired. No exceptions. The mission doesn't matter. The urgency doesn't matter. Your safety matters. Third rule. If you see something unsafe, you say something. You don't ask permission. You don't wait for authorization. You speak up and we fix it." He paused. "And fourth rule, if you're ever uncomfortable or unsure about a procedure, you stop and ask. There's no punishment for asking questions. There's no shame in admitting you don't know something. The only stupid question is the one you don't ask because you're afraid." Greta wiped her face with the handkerchief. "These rules," she said hoarsely. "You actually follow them?" Chen nodded. "We actually follow them. I've shut down operations because a technician reported a funny smell from a transformer. Turned out to be nothing, just dust burning off, but we checked it anyway. I've sent people home because they were too tired to work safely. I've requisitioned equipment that cost thousands of dollars because someone said they needed it to do their job properly." He met her eyes. "Your life is worth more than any radio set. Your health is worth more than any mission. That's not sentiment. That's policy. That's law. Any officer who tells you otherwise is breaking regulations and can be court-martialed." Greta looked down at the boots again. In the underground facility in Berlin, the radio sets had been kept in climate-controlled rooms, carefully maintained, their components precious and irreplaceable. The women who operated them had worked in whatever they could scavenge, in cold that made their fingers stiff, in heat that left them dizzy, in conditions that would have damaged the equipment if the equipment had been subjected to them. The equipment had been valuable. The women had been replaceable. She thought about Christina, limping through the facility with her ruined feet, reassigned to filing because she couldn't stand for long periods anymore. She thought about Else, her hands shaking too badly to hold a soldering iron, transferred to some other department, some other use, wrung dry and discarded. She thought about all the other women in the facility, working in canvas shoes or barefoot, breathing solder fumes without ventilation, lifting heavy equipment without help, told over and over that their sacrifice was necessary, that their suffering was service, that their pain was patriotism. And she thought about the male engineers in their proper boots, with their proper equipment, with their proper safety procedures, walking past the women's workstations without seeing, without caring, without questioning why half the workforce was expendable. The boots on her feet felt like an accusation. Chen was watching her with concern. "Miss Hoffman," he said gently, "I know this is a lot to process. We don't have to start work today. You can take time to adjust." She shook her head. "No," she said. Her voice was steadier now. "Show me the safety procedures. Show me how you ground the equipment. Show me how Americans value their workers more than their machines." He did. For the next 2 hours, Chen walked her through the radio operations building, explaining every safety feature, every grounding point, every emergency shutoff. He showed her the fire extinguishers, the first aid kit, the emergency exits. He demonstrated proper grounding technique, using a test meter to verify zero voltage before touching any component. He showed her the insulated tools, the rubber mats, the safety goggles. He explained the buddy system, the mandatory brakes, the ergonomic workstations designed to reduce strain. Every procedure, every piece of equipment, every rule was designed with one principle. The person doing the work mattered more than the work being done. It was obscene. It was impossible. It was everything the underground facility in Berlin had not been. At one point, Chen handed her a test meter and asked her to check the grounding on a radio set. She did automatically, her hands remembering the familiar motions. The meter showed zero voltage. The equipment was properly grounded, safe. If this showed voltage, she asked, what would you do? Chen didn't hesitate. "I'd tag the equipment as unsafe, lock it out so no one could use it, and submit a repair order. The equipment would stay offline until it was fixed and tested, no matter how urgently it was needed." No matter how urgently it was needed. Greta set down the test meter. Her hands were shaking again. "In Berlin," she said quietly, "I reported a grounding fault 3 times. 3 times I was told to keep working. 3 times I was told the equipment was needed. The 4th time I checked, my meter showed voltage. I reported it again. I was told I was being hysterical. I was told the meter was faulty. I was told to stop wasting everyone's time." She looked up at Chen. 2 days later, Christina touched that equipment and the current went through her feet and up her legs, and she screamed so loud I can still hear it when I close my eyes. Chen's face was white. "Did anyone face consequences? Did the person who ignored your reports face any punishment?" Greta laughed, that same humorless sound. "He was promoted. Herr Dr. Schmidt. He was promoted to chief engineer for the entire facility, because he kept the equipment operational, because he didn't let safety concerns slow down the work, because the mission mattered more than the women." She felt the tears coming again but pushed them back. "After Christina, we stopped reporting problems. What was the point? We just worked around them. We developed our own safety procedures, our own warnings, our own systems. We took care of each other because no one else would." Chen was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything. I know it doesn't fix what happened to you or to Christina or to Else. But I'm sorry." And I promise you, I swear to you, that will never happen in any facility I supervise. Greta believed him. That was the worst part. She actually believed him. That afternoon, she worked on a simple repair job, replacing a faulty capacitor in a radio receiver. Chen supervised, checking her work, offering suggestions, treating her like a skilled technician rather than a prisoner or a resource to be used up. When she finished, he inspected the repair, nodded approval, and logged it in his maintenance book. "Good work," he said. "Clean solder joints, proper component placement, correct polarity. You clearly know what you're doing." The praise felt strange, unfamiliar. In Berlin, good work had been expected, demanded, taken for granted. Only mistakes were noticed. Only failures were acknowledged. Success was invisible. When the work day ended, Chen walked her back to the barracks. At the door, he paused. "Miss Hoffman," he said, "I want you to know that you can talk to me if you need to. Not about classified information, just about anything else. If the work is too difficult, if you need different equipment, if you're having trouble adjusting. I'm not your enemy." Greta looked at him, this middle-aged American man with his wire-rimmed glasses and his genuine concern, and felt something shift inside her. "I know," she said. That night in the barracks, Margaret asked her about the work. "What did they have you do?" she asked. "Were they cruel? Did they try to make you reveal secrets?" Greta sat on her bunk and looked down at her feet, still wearing the boots. Chen had told her she could keep them, that they were hers, that she should wear them whenever she was working with equipment. "They gave me boots," she said. Margaret frowned. "Boots. That's all, just boots." Greta unlaced them slowly, carefully, and set them beside her bunk. "They gave me boots," she repeated, "and safety procedures, and respect, and the knowledge that for 3 years I worked for people who valued radio components more than human lives." She lay back on her mattress, staring at the ceiling. Margaret didn't understand. None of them could, not unless they'd worked in the underground facility, not unless they'd seen Christina's burns or heard Elsa's screams, or felt the constant low-grade terror of working around high-voltage equipment with no protection. But Greta understood. She understood that the boots weren't just boots. They were a symbol, a statement, a condemnation. They were proof that safety equipment wasn't a luxury or a privilege. They were proof that the people she'd worked for, the regime she'd served, had treated her as less valuable than the machines she operated. They were proof that she'd been expendable. Over the following weeks, Greta settled into a routine. She worked in the radio operations building 5 days a week, repairing equipment, testing circuits, training other POWs who had electronic skills. Chen was patient, thorough, and true to his word. When she reported a problem, he fixed it. When she asked for equipment, he got it. When she admitted she didn't know something, he taught her without judgment. The boots became comfortable, broken in, familiar. She wore them every day, even when she wasn't working, because they reminded her of something important. They reminded her that she had value, that her safety mattered, that she was more than a resource to be used up and discarded. Other women in the camp noticed. They asked about the boots, about the work, about the Americans. Greta told them the truth, that the Americans treated their workers, even POW workers, with more care and respect than the Reich had treated its own citizens. Some women didn't believe her. Some thought it was a trick, a manipulation, a way to break their loyalty. But others understood. Others had their own stories of being treated as expendable, of being valued only for what they could produce, of being discarded when they broke. One evening in November, as the Colorado winter began to bite, Greta was working late in the radio operations building. Chen had gone home, trusting her to lock up when she finished. She was alone with the equipment. the familiar smell of hot electronics, the soft glow of vacuum tubes. She thought about the underground facility in Berlin, about the women who might still be working there if the facility still existed, if Berlin still existed. She thought about Christina and Else and all the others, and she looked down at her boots, at the thick rubber soles that kept her safe, and she cried again. But this time the tears were different. This time they were for the women she'd left behind, for the women who would never get proper boots, for the women who would keep working in canvas shoes or barefoot because their regime valued machines more than people. She cried for the waste of it, for the cruelty of it, for the sheer, stupid, unnecessary evil of it. And she cried because she was safe now and they weren't, and she didn't know how to live with that knowledge. When she finally left the building, locking the door behind her as Chen had shown her, the night was cold and clear. The stars over Colorado were brighter than any stars she'd ever seen, unclouded by smoke or fear. She walked back to the barracks in her boots, her feet warm and protected, and tried to figure out how to be a person who mattered, how to be a person whose safety was valued, how to be a person instead of a resource. It would take time. It would take years, maybe, but she had boots. She had safety procedures. She had proof that another way was possible, and somehow, impossibly, that was enough to start with.